podcast. My name is Bublitz, and welcome back to the 13th Sunday after Pentecost for the week of September 7th, 2025. I'm excited to have you here. I'm excited to dig in this week's podcast, and I'm excited. Wow, we are now into September. It's amazing how fast the year goes. It's amazing. I know where I'm at. I'm starting to see some early things happening that it's starting to look like we're starting to have indications that the weather is changing. And I'm hoping that wherever you're at, that it's at least the same type of thing. It's a good time of year, at least in the Northern Hemisphere. We start getting prepared for thinking about fall. I'm hoping there's still at least a few more weeks of some good weather and warmer weather before we start preparing for the cold where I'm at. But I think this is a season where there's a lot of change, depending on where you are in the world. But at least here in the United States, you have parts of the United States that have gone back to school, other parts that are going back to school. So it's this transitionary period of time where we start moving back into a different routine, moving out of a summer routine into more of a school year routine for a lot of folks. So it's a transitionary period of time, and I think it really is a good time of year to be kind of reflecting on different questions, especially the question that we had for last week, which was, where is pride taking over your Sabbath? And I think that's, at least within American culture where I'm at, I think that's a very difficult question to answer, because I think a lot of it comes back down to the idea of I'm supposed to always be busy. I always have things going on. And the lack of being able to take rest and Sabbath, I think, is an important thing that at times it's easy for us to overlook or to forget about or just not do. And it doesn't provide the care that we're needing. We often need this care of us being able to take care of ourselves through a Sabbath, through some period of time where we slow down for a period of time. And in a world that's getting used to the idea of constantly having something going on, constantly going, constantly, it's difficult for us to sometimes find that peace, find that moment where we slow down. And I would argue if we don't do that, I think the gospel text and where we're going this week becomes more difficult because we don't ever allow ourselves that Sabbath. But in order for us to get there, we have to start with the first reading. So one of the first readings that you can potentially have this week is out of Jeremiah chapter 18, the first 11 verses of it. This is a really fun text, and it's one of these moments where Jeremiah gets this calling from God to go to the potter's house and to hear the words that the potter has to say. And he has this vessel on the potter's wheel that's not working well. It's spoiled. It's not going to work well. So what ends up happening, it collapses it down and rebuilds it into something new and is able to rebuild it into a vessel that is able to be utilized. And this is kind of this representation on how the potter understands what's going on. The potter understands, no, this is something I need to rebuild. This is something where if I do this or do that, it's going to respond this way and be able to make this into a useful vessel. It's one of these really cool moments here where we get this imaging so directly with how God is able to shape and mold and work within us. And I think it's a great image for us to be looking at. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 139, the first 6 verses of that, and 13 through 18. This is one of these texts that goes through the idea how God knows us so well. God knows our innermost parts. God has been there since the beginning. And in doing that, then we need to be able to recognize how, one, there is the fear of someone understanding us so well, but also then the security that comes with that. Because God understands how well we are made, God understands our weaknesses, but also understands our strengths. God is then able to take these, mold these, and shape these, and be able to make us into these amazing people that are able and capable of doing amazing things if we allow the Maker to actually work with us. The other Old Testament text this week is out of Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 15 to 20. This then is one of these moments where God is stating here that as long as we are following the commandments, following the ordinances of what God has called us into, it makes it much easier for us to follow along with where God is guiding us. And we're going to find that there's a lot of things where God then continues to enter in and open doors for us. But it's also this idea of how we as people with free will who can exit that path anytime also makes for this catch-22, whereas if we don't do that, it can make things more difficult, it can make them harder, and thus we don't live up to where God is trying to steer us, where God is able to say, I understand who you are. There's certain aspects of who you are that I have purposely designed in this way. Thus, let me be able to mold you and guide you in those and be able to lead you with where I'm trying to lead you. The psalm that goes with that is Psalm 1, all 6 verses of it. And recognizing that when we spend time with the Lord, this is a moment and a time where we are able to then delight in knowing God and being able to be near God, and thus being able to be fed and nourished and giving us life in which we're needed. And thus it allows us to not be just blown away, not just be taken off course, not just be caught up in whatever is going on. It gives us a rooting, it gives us stability, and it also allows us the ability to grow because we have that foundation. The epistle text or second reading this week is from Philemon chapter 1, the first 21 verses of it. This is a very uncommonly used book, and I enjoy this book tremendously. But this is a moment here where we have Paul writing, and Paul is acknowledging how he's been in prison, but he continues to be praying for his brothers and sisters that are out doing the work that he has called them to, specifically his brother Timothy, who is leading this group of people. And this is where then he brings up Philemon, who is a slave that he has met in prison, but is recognizing how the label of what people have perceived him to be previously might shadow and cast doubt on who he is now today. That this aspect on how Paul has spent time pouring into him and has seen him grow and evolve and be able to carry one's faith in a very strong way, and thus he isn't this prisoner, he isn't this slave that has been seen before, and thus is asking them to welcome him back into the community, recognizing that there's evolution and change has happened within this person. And I think that's a key aspect this week, especially with where we're going in the gospel text, but recognizing how with coming into Christ and continuing to grow in Christ, we should be continuing to evolve. The gospel text this week is then out of Luke chapter 14, starting at verse 25 to 33. Jesus then gives us some difficult text here as he is walking with the crowd. Starting in verse 26, whoever comes to me but does not hate father and mother, wife and child, brothers and sisters, yes, and even life itself cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not carry the cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. For which of you intended to build a tower and does not sit down and to estimate the cost, to see whether he has enough to complete it? Otherwise, when he has laid a foundation and is not able to finish it, all who see it will begin to ridicule him. This is then this recognition on how we have to continue to evolve and understand and grow. And we get that then starting also in verse 31, where we get this example of a king waging war, but then recognizing that there is a huge army, much greater than what he has, thus being able to go and try to make peace with that army. So therefore, none of you can become my disciple if you do not give up your possessions. And I think this is this recognition on how we have to continue to be able to evolve and change. We have to be able to acknowledge where we are right now does not mean that's where we're going to be forever. So before we jump into how faith and science come together this week, we have to do a shameless plugs for Working Preacher. If you haven't checked out Working Preacher, I'd highly recommend it. Between their Sermon Brainwaves podcasts or commentaries or discussions, since I'm not an ordained minister, I use them on a weekly basis to help me give me some ideas, direction, ways to be looking at things to be considering. So if you haven't checked out workingpreacher.org, I'd highly recommend it. I'd also highly recommend checking out the Revised Common Lectionary coming from Vanderbilt's Community Library. I really enjoy how they lay out the text week to week, but also having art, prayers, hymns, liturgical colors, different daily readings that you can get into. This is such a dense resource to be able to help you prepare for worship week after week. And I would argue, whether you're in front of the congregation, in front of the pews, or sitting in the pews, this is definitely a resource that is worth checking out and getting prepared for worship to make sure that you are able to soak in as much as you possibly can during that worship service. Finally, I'd also highly recommend checking out the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publication. This is either a weekly reflection going through ecological echoes, implications, and urgencies into the weekly lectionary, similar to like what I'm doing, or a monthly newsletter that able to have links to those different texts along with different resources and ideas and things to be going through. If you enjoy listening to me talk about science every week for a half an hour, I really think you're going to enjoy some of the different things that come out of the Green Blades Preaching Roundtable and the Green Blades Rising publications. It's a great resource, and that'll be the first link down in the resources section of the show notes. Evolving and changing is something that I think as people assume we have understood. But I would also argue, as I have gotten older and older, I have also recognized more and more how I have become more and more stubborn about certain things, that this is the way that they need to be. And yet, this is a text that argues that that's not the way that things are intended to be. And I think it reiterates another situation, we'll put it, that we have to recognize that we as humans are the ones who struggle with this idea. If you look into our ecosystems, we recognize that there are cycles of things, and we sometimes struggle with that recognition of those cycles. Every cycle and every part of the cycle is still a valid and important part of the cycle. And sometimes we try skipping or going through them very quickly or trying to figure out ways that we don't have to deal with that cycle. When we do that, it prevents us from fully understanding the value of that section of cycle. And sometimes it disrupts the broader ecosystem at large, or the broader cycle of faith at large, because we're trying to skip over things. This year, one of the things that it's been a little bit odd, if you ended up at my house, is there's a row of pine trees that we have. And over the years, I've cut down various different ones because they have struggled from the day that we have moved in, basically. And some of them have seemed to recover well this year, and some I am very confident will not recover, as I've watched their needles turn brown and the cones still sit on these trees. And this year I decided to wait. I know that there's other little pines that I have that I can go and replace these trees, and at some point I probably will. But I've also this year determined that I was going to leave them up for the majority of the year. One, partially because I didn't get to it. Two, secondly, for the birds. I figured at minimum to see what would happen. And three, so I didn't accidentally cut down a tree that was really trying to keep its life going. And there's been some that have seemed to have some recovery this year. There's still some that aren't looking great. But there's also a value to that last aspect that I have noticed this year, and that is the value of a dead tree. The value of a dead tree still can be a place for a bird to rest. It still can be a place for a bird to build a nest. It still can be a place that is utilized. And yes, I've watched as the woodpeckers have gone into those trees, but it's also recognizing that those trees then have had insects that are probably starting to begin the process of deteriorating that tree, breaking it down so that it can live, but also slowly getting it so that it can return back to the earth and getting all its nutrients out of it so that they are able to grow and be able to slowly bring all the different nutrients of that tree to the soil that is around it, which has also then provided holes for woodpeckers to try to go after these different insects that are there in that tree. There's also, as we've talked about recently, the mycelium that it probably had a year ago, maybe, going and communicating with the trees that I'm not going to make it, but here's a flush of nutrients to make sure that you guys can do as well as you possibly can, as I'm not going to make it. And me potentially cutting down that tree earlier reiterates the issue of it may or may not have done that if I do it as it's looking like it's starting to turn. In that tree and those trees that I've noticed, I've started to notice just how much they still are utilized. And what I may see as useless is still useful. Those trees provide shelter. Those trees provide a resting place. Those trees provide food. Those trees provide nutrients. Those trees are still part of a natural cycle that if I left it long enough, it would slowly deteriorate and get back to the point where it would return all the nutrients back to the soil or get gobbled up, allowing for something else to grow in that spot. It is then in the potter's hands, being ready and recuperating and getting the place ready for the next piece of clay to suddenly be utilized to build something there. This is a common occurrence when you start thinking of forests, and that there's going to be trees that die every year. There's going to be some that make it and don't. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they immediately get taken down. There's still a vital role that they have to play within that ecosystem. And at some point they will fall, and at some point they will return fully back to the earth, and thus giving the nutrients back to the earth to allow it to start the cycle again with another tree or some other vegetation to start growing. But we as humans don't necessarily like seeing that. We don't like thinking about that aspect. We don't like the idea that there is cycles to life sometimes, and thus us recognizing that there are things that come and go within life. And we have to be able to adjust and adapt to that. I know for me, one of the things that has been a challenge at times over the last 10 years is I did not want to leave where I grew up. I love the area. I love the place that I grew up. And there was a lot of things that I did enjoy. But for me, especially when I got out of college, there wasn't many job opportunities there. Nothing that really gave me forward momentum, as I felt, that I needed to get moving. And eventually, as I've kind of stated, I moved to a different area, moved to northern Minnesota, and found an opportunity where I was able to move forward. I think sometimes we have to recognize, as much as I didn't want to leave, I had to. I needed to move on to that next phase of my life. And thus it also meant within faith too, I had to continue to grow and not just lean on things that I was familiar with. It was going to be a challenge. It was going to be something that meant moving and adjusting and changing. I think as humans within various different phases of our lives and various different aspects, we struggle with that idea. And I think that's somewhat what Jesus is getting at here. Sometimes we have to quit with this is the way that it's been and this is the way that it always will be. Because in doing that, we're holding on to these possessions. We're holding on to these things. And we're not allowing God to come in and change and grow us. There is times that trees need to die to be able to allow for other trees to grow. And when we think about it in a forest context, when a tree dies and is taking up less and less space, it allows the trees around it to fill in. It allows them to take advantage of that and grow. When I look culturally, at least here in the United States, I think that's something that we are really struggling with in multiple facets. We struggle with the idea of how things are changing and evolving, and am I keeping up? We're struggling with the idea of holding culturally what we have done before, but also recognizing that their world is changing, and where are the key pillars that we're going to build things around? What are the things and the traditions that do help us connect back, which is still important? And yet we can still look at Jesus himself, still following the Passover and still doing a lot of those different traditions that are needed to connect, but also recognizing that not every single one of them is vital for them to continue to move forward. Finding that balance of holding that is hard. In order for us to grow, we have to make sure that we are allowing ourselves the ability to grow, which means sometimes that we have to let things go. We have to set some things down for a while. We also might need to set things down and never pick them up again, too. And it doesn't mean that we don't love them. It doesn't mean we don't care about them. It just means that things are changing. Things are evolving. And I think that's the aspect. And I think it's very difficult. I know I've talked with different people before as they've changed professions or if they retire. There's so much that we wrap up in our titles on who we are and how we define ourselves and what the job is that we do, that it's easy for us in doing that we forget that then when we let go of that, that's okay. I know for me, being trained as a biologist, and I haven't done field research or lab research in over 8 years now. It's not that I'm not still a scientist. It's just that I'm a different type of scientist now. I'm more doing observations, and I've done a lot of civilian science and noticing things and talking with people and making observations. And maybe I'm not the person who's going to have these major breakthroughs like at one point I maybe thought I was going to. Instead, I'm doing much different work, maybe helping to communicate scientific topics to a population who isn't always the most scientific literate, and being able to break down terms and be an intermediary that is still very needed. But as I get further and further from that too, there's an aspect too that evolves and changes as well. And it's not necessarily that it's bad. It's meaning that I'm growing into the next phase of who I am. It's hard letting go. It's hard letting go of titles that we're used to and we're accustomed to. And thus, in doing that, it prevents us from growing. It prevents us from seeing the opportunities of what we see as dead and gone to becoming something much greater than what we realize. A dead tree is still very valuable. It may not be of the living anymore, but it still provides a lot to the living. I may not be practicing as a quote-unquote scientist during my typical 9 to 5, but I still serve as a vital piece to be able to help interpret and help give insight into things that I was taught when I was learning and growing in that field. Being able to identify and think and being able to bring those worlds together. That's still a very important role, and I wouldn't say that when I started this podcast that that's what I was initially thinking that I was going to do. Maybe this is partially that I'm reflecting as I'm, recently hit that 400 mark, but it's also thinking about when I started out on this, it was the idea that this is something that the church is needing that will get people then talking about science in church and how that can get some forward momentum and help us with a lot of these different scientific communications that really need to be happening. I've had to evolve. I've had to change. That isn't exactly where the insight on where I think this podcast is now. And it's not that I was doing things wrong. It's that I had to adjust. And I'm still trying to figure out and adjust on what's next. And figuring out how to make sure that this is continually a podcast to grow and help and nourish people who are on the other end listening to this. What we see sometimes as dead is not dead. What we see as something that we are needing to evolve and change, we need to sometimes be able to recognize that and acknowledge then that there's things that we need to let down and allow that change to happen. Birds go from highly territorial in the spring and summer to working together to migrate to their wintering grounds together. They allow themselves to the ability to be able to evolve and change. We recognize and look at, as we talked about previous weeks here, talking about how flowers prepare and share to allow themselves that opportunity where they go through and rest and acknowledge change that's happening. There isn't as much sunlight. The temperatures are cooler. We're not going to grow right now. We're going to wait and prepare. And I think in a lot of ways with where we are in the world, it's not necessarily that everything has to stop and we go into the season of just pondering. But I do think there's a lot of times within a lot of these different places, we need to acknowledge and have a season of that. And as we are in the season after Pentecost of green and growth, I think it's not just acknowledging this, but internalizing it and figuring out when are we actually going to do this. And the hard thing is it's not just as an individual, it's not just as a community of believers, it's as a whole organization as well. being able to walk out this faith is hard. And that means there's times that we have to let things go. There's times we have to adjust to what our new role is, yet doesn't seem useful, maybe on the surface, but provides a lot of help and necessary requirements for us. Personally, I think in a lot of ways, this is where the global church is at. We're at this moment where we need to reconsider and rethink about how we do church. And it's not easy. It's not necessarily fun either, because there's a lot of things that we do hold near and dear that are very important to us. But is it actually helping us forward the mission of what we are called to as church communities? Or are we holding on to it because we're used to it? And I think that's a very difficult question to answer, and it takes a lot of time, prayer, and contemplation to really figure out. And that's part of what the beauty of science is yes, we go and we find the research and we do the stuff and we look at things, but at some point you also have to have, as we talked about before, the discussion section and conclusions, where you have to sit and take the data, interpret it, and think about it. Understand that we are in cycles of life, understand that we are in cycles of churches, and there's times for rejuvenation and rethought and allowing things to be put down and said that has been good, but it's time for something new. I don't have all those answers. I wish I did, but it's one of those things that I think a lot of us need to just sit with and think about. So the question I have for you this week is, where do we need to put something down to allow something to grow? Where do we need to put something down to allow something to grow? Because I think at that point, we are really able to actually figure out what we are trying to accomplish. We are in a moment within time where we need to be working on our discussion sections of a lot of different issues. Raising good questions, thinking about things, thinking critically, taking the information that we have, and coming to some questions and things that we need to further test. And there might be certain aspects that maybe we are in the conclusion phase. The conclusion of either that we need to keep this or we need to let this go. And I think within our own lives personally, we need to make sure that we are doing that ourselves. Going through and evaluating and thinking about and recognizing that just because we put it down doesn't mean it's still not there when we need it. And it doesn't necessarily mean that it's unuseful. It sometimes means it actually allows it to be more useful in a different way. So, we'll wrap this up as we always do. I pray God blesses you through your faith and amazes you through science.